All right, so Ephesians chapter 6, we have been making our way through this book as we study. The next book we're coming to will be Philippians, and I think we may get there next week. It's kind of my tentative plan. But we went through each of the chapters, looking at some of the contextual things that deal directly with the Ephesians and trying to make some bigger application to us. Chapter 1, we looked at the substance of the church. Chapter 2, salvation of the church. Chapter 3, the scheme of the church, how God has laid out this plan from before the foundations of this world. Chapter 4, we looked at the singularity of the church, the unity that we should strive for. Chapter 5, we finished up last week looking at the sanctification of the church. Again, that word sanctification means set apart. We as Christians have been set apart from the evil world in order to serve God. In that chapter, we look at verse 21, Ephesians 5:21, where Paul says we ought to do what? Submit to one another. And as we continue reading forward, he's discussing some of the areas in our lives where submission is important. And again, submission is the idea of putting oneself under the control of someone else. And so we talked about husbands and wives, their relationship, and then also the relationship of the church in Christ. A good kind of time to plug again marriage and family training, right? As we're thinking about our families, our homes, it's important for us to continue to build those foundations, to strengthen them, and so please make your plans to be here April 4th. All right, so let's move on into chapter 6. This is where we'll get started in verse 1, and we'll look at some more instructions Paul gives. Ephesians chapter 6 and verse number 1. Paul, writing to the Ephesians, says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land." We'll come back to verse 4 in just a minute, but let's just deal with those first three to start off. So Paul, he goes in this discussion where? He's going back to the beginning of the law of Moses. So if we go to Exodus chapter 20, there Moses is delivering the first commandments. These are going to be the cornerstone of all the other commandments to come afterwards. But if we go back to Exodus chapter 20, and we're going to look specifically at verse 12. Let me venture over there. Exodus 20 and verse number 12. All right, so he's given us, the commandments to honor God, those first three. The fourth was to honor the Sabbath day. And then we come to verse 12. He says, "Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you." Do you notice anything that Paul adds to that verse in his quoting of it? Any kind of additional thought or commentary he gives us in Ephesians 6? What's that, Neil? With a promise, right? This is the first commandment with a promise. I want to explore the promise as we go through here. Before we get there, though, when we talk about the term honor, what do we mean? What do we mean by honor? What does that term denote biblically? Respect. Okay. Obedience. Love. So respect, obedience, love. Well, you can't. To appreciate. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
To behave in a manner that will not embarrass them.
Okay, okay, good. Steve?
Well, based on Jesus' interaction with them when he's talking about honoring the parents, he mentioned that they were taking that money and not using it to support their family and committing it to the synagogue, but then or whatever, and it was using it for their own use.
Absolutely. So the Pharisees had made a workaround in honoring your parents. They weren't caring for them as they properly should. And I'll have to look up the exact scripture reference. So sorry, but that's a good one to point out, where they were saying you could take the money you would spend on your parents, and then you can give it as a gift to the Lord, and thereby you've honored your parents. And Jesus, is he going to accept that? Well, if you go back and read the text, again, if anybody can remember where that exact quotation comes from, they're not honoring their parents as they should, because there was actually something required of them in regard to their parents. They couldn't just shuffle it off to somebody else to take care of them, or they couldn't shuffle off their responsibility they had to them. Good point. Is there anything else? So we've thrown out several good terms I like. So you think about the idea of respectful respectful behavior, respectful attitude, right? You think about obedience. We talked about loving them, appreciating them. What were you going to say, Steve?
Mark 7:10.
Mark 7:10, thank you. That's the reference where he talks about this practice they had developed through their traditions of trying to get around having to honor your parents. And I think all those are good. I think all those kind of hit on the idea. But does Paul, now I know we're kind of flipping back and forth, but does Paul give any kind of qualifier when he says honor your father and mother? There's something else he does here. Yeah, so you also notice that he adds that addendum on it within the law of Christ. You honor them in the Lord. So in the Lord, what do you think that denotes, biblically speaking? What exactly is he saying when he adds that that phrase, prepositional phrase? I learned all about prepositions this year. What? Okay. So do you only have to honor your parents if they follow Christ?
But you don't do something that's against Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Even if your parents do.
Yes, and I think you're hitting right on the doorstep there, right? It is this idea that I obey my parents to the extent that they're not asking me to violate Christ, right? So I was thinking about this afternoon, just to give a real life example of this that I know I've seen, is let's say you're a young person, maybe in your teens or in your early 20s, and you sit down and have a Bible study with somebody, and you find out the gospel plan of salvation. Yet your whole life you've been taught all you need to do is have faith or believe or say the sinner's prayer, and that's enough. Well, what you're hearing biblically is really coming against that. So, and maybe you've let's say in this situation, you've heard that from your parents. They've said, all you got to do is believe. You're a Christian, you know that. But then what you're hearing in a Bible study doesn't line up with that when you actually read the Bible. So you've got a situation there, don't you? So what do?
Do like Peter did, said, should I obey you or should I obey the Lord? You judge.
Yeah, Acts chapter 4, right? Isn't that where he says that? So that's a real life situation. I know this has come up. I've seen it a lot. And so then you've got a difficulty there of what do you do, right? And it becomes even more so when you have parents who are very dogmatic about the way they've always believed, even though it doesn't agree with Scripture, but they believe it. And for you to obey the truth is coming up against what they've always taught you, and they may be really upset. So what do? Well, you do what the Lord's called you to do. He's the higher authority in that situation, right? And so you submit to Him. Now, how do I do that and still honor my parents?
Do it lovingly. Honor God, obey God lovingly.
I totally agree, but explain what that means. What does that look like?
Show them scriptures.
There you go.
Show them scriptures.
We still take care of their needs. If they're hungry, we're going to feed them.
Mm-hmm.
If there's a physical need, and you would try to talk as occasions can be made or looked into, you try to talk to them.
Yeah. And I think it's also how you deal with them, right? It has a lot to do with how you interact with them. We're not going to change the truth, but I can show respect and disagree, can I? I can do that. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I've been with people when they had a real conflict with their parents. And for a time, their parents kind of disowned them. Now, some of those situations have turned for the better, where they've at least their parents have learned to accept that they're not going to believe the way they do. But it caused some turmoil in that relationship. I think what's important for us as obedient believers is not to be the cause of turmoil because of our dishonorable behavior, disrespectful behavior, right? We can disagree with someone and still be respectful about it. I can hold to the truth firmly and still be respectful. Everybody agree?
Would it be better if they didn't talk about, I know it's a situation where a guy would not be baptized and people all the time to their parents and they'd say, oh no. So hopefully later when you got older and did, but I just really sad that they didn't just
Well, okay, so I can right there with you. I know of situations just like that. I've also seen situations where the person went ahead and did it, but I have seen where they called. Now, there's not a clear-cut answer from my standpoint. Maybe you have better experience with it. I don't know if there's a clear-cut answer. I think each situation you have to deal with differently. But I'm going to tell the person. Here's what I think. If you're the one doing the study with a person, what I would try to do as a Christian is I would say to that person, know when you go home, they're not going to like it. And you need to go in with the mindset that they're not going to just accept what I'm doing, most likely. And so if you're dead set on going to your parents and talking to them about it, you got to do what your heart tells you, not your heart, but your mind is telling you to do. But those are difficult situations, and I don't know there's always a clear-cut answer. Yes, sir.
Don't forget, in chapter 6, verse 1, one of the key points is obey your parents in the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
For this is right.
Yeah.
So,
And this would be a great scripture to bring them to before you let them go. And I would say, look at this. You know what the truth is. And I don't know if I would say this to everybody, but I have at times I've said Satan's going to use them to try to create some doubt in your mind or some compromise in your mind. I'm like, just be ready for it. It's going to happen. And then I would say, look at what Paul says. Obey them, honor them in the Lord, right? And great question. And unfortunately, I've seen situations that happen like that. I've seen other situations where the person says, no, I'm not waiting on my parents. And I always think this is the better one. I know what the truth is. I'm going to do what God called me to do now. And now, then I can begin the work of trying to convert my parents to the truth. Yes, ma'am.
Something that came to my mind was, I think it was Simon Peter and his brother when they were fishing. No, I don't know who it was, but they were talking about, let me go and bury the dead. And he was like, the dad will bury himself. And the connection that I'm having with this current discussion we have is like, if they are not following Christ, they're dead. So you still have to follow me regardless.
Absolutely. Yeah. I believe what you're talking about is a parable. Or not a parable. Jesus is talking kind of in abstraction about different situations. And he's talking about different people that come to him. One person just got married and says, I just got married and I can't go. And then another, is this the parable of the wedding feast, I believe?
They're using excuses.
No, they were fishing.
They're using excuses to not follow him.
Yeah.
I gotta go do this.
And I know the parable of the wedding feast is where they send out invitations and people give all kinds of excuses. Like one person's, I just bought a field and I need to go till it. Another person says, I just got married, and another person, and it's a whole line of I'm not familiar with another one. We can talk about that and see where it would be. But I think the situation is the same. Whereas, sometimes we've got to follow Christ. There's another time when he talks about Matthew chapter 10, where he's talking about, I didn't bring peace but a sword. And he starts talking about families and how in order to be a Christian, sometimes it calls us to go against what our families have always believed. And do I have the courage and the faith to do that? And so then that really is on me. Absolutely. If anybody can find that text, we'll read it. Any others? Good comments. So we may have challenging situations where we have a reason to disagree respectfully with our parents. But Paul says that in all other situations we strive for what? To honor our parents, to show them honor. Again, he makes this statement in Ephesians 6:4. He says, honor your father and mother. Ephesians 6:2. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise. Now that part was something, that's a commentary. You'll notice that it's probably in parentheses, which indicates it wasn't in Exodus. But this is a commentary Paul is giving us on this particular commandment. So when he says this is the first commandment with a promise, what is the promise that he's offering? Well, that it may go well with you and what?
And you may live
long in the land. All right, so you may initially think, well, that must mean they give you good advice, they help you to be healthy and to be strong and to be smart. But there's actually a more practical thing going on here. Go with me to Deuteronomy chapter 21. Deuteronomy chapter 21. And let's go to verse 18. Okay, so Exodus 20, that's the foundation, the beginnings of the law of Moses. This is something that was given in the law of Moses a little bit later, but it really speaks to that commandment. Deuteronomy 21, verse 18. Let's read a few verses here. So Moses writes, if a man has a stubborn and rebellious son, you'd call them somebody who doesn't honor your parents, right? Who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and though they discipline him. So there's a qualifier in this sentence, isn't it? What's the qualifier? Yeah, they're actually disciplining their children, right? It's not a child who's grown up in just a wild home life where they've never gotten any discipline or training. We've seen homes like that in the Old Testament. You think about, who was the judge right before Samuel? Eli, thank you. I kept wanting to say Elias, and I was like, that's not right. Eli. Well, the statement's made about Eli, what? He didn't chastise his children. He didn't train them. So it's not talking about that kind of home, but it's saying in a home where there's been training going on, yet the child will what? Not listen to them. Then his father and his mother shall, not may, notice that's not conditional, shall do what? Shall take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of his city at the gate of the place where he lives. And they shall say to the elders of the city, this our son is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Those are pretty heavy crimes levied at him. You'd also notice this is not an 8-year-old child. It's an older child. So bring him out. They then lay the claim before what they're bringing him for. Then verse 21, then all the men of the city shall stone him to death with stones. And before I get to the last part of that, we'll come back to that in just a second. So just notice what's going on. You've got a rebellious, stubborn child who has refused to hear the instructions of his parents. You also notice it's not a young child. This has been an ongoing problem. Now, what the Bible does not give us is the age at which this should take place. There's some discretion for parents here. But they had the full right, with a child who would not listen, to have them stoned to death. Now, just for a minute, think about how hard that would be for you as a parent. How desperate you would be in order to get to that level. This is a child who is absolutely a child who will not listen, a child who will not receive any kind of training. And they're to be taken out and stoned to death. Now that, in our modern culture, just seems outlandish, right? Child abuse is what people would say. Maybe. But why is God saying this? Notice the end of verse 21. So you shall what? Purge is the English Standard Translation. Purge the evil from your midst, and all Israel shall hear and fear. Who is this really about? Israel, right? The nation. And it's about another word that I mentioned a couple weeks ago, the idea of authority. Teaching our children to understand authority is so vitally important. They need to understand what authority is and what it means. I am convinced that many of the problems we face, if we as people in general understood authority, we wouldn't have nearly the problems we have. But the respect of authority is something that is not what it used to be. I was watching one thing and they were talking about, I won't go there. There used to be an idea that was taught by men like Dr. Spock, and I'm not talking about Star Wars, I'm talking about the other guy who wrote the children's book, who said you should never discipline a child. It stunts their growth. It harms their intellect. This is what he believed. And we had a generation who was raised like that. And a generation that did not respect authority. Now, we've been noticing this in our Genesis study, but what happens with sin over time? Does it lessen? It becomes greater and more severe. Go read the book of Genesis and each successive generation and see how the sin expanded with each generation of people. And so much of that comes back to a lack of appreciation for authority. Because in essence, when we honor our parents, who do we ultimately honor? God. You remember Joseph. When Joseph was with Potiphar's wife and she's begging him to commit adultery with her, and she at one point even grabs him by the coat so hard and so aggressively that he has to shed the coat and run for it. You remember what he said to her when she first started doing this? She says, how can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Now, ultimately, what Joseph is showing is honor. He's honoring Potiphar, right? But by honoring Potiphar, he's also showing honor to her, because to do that with her would mean to involve her in sin. So he's honoring both of his masters, but ultimately he's really honoring God. And he understands to break that honor, to sin that way, was not only to dishonor Potiphar, but it was really a dishonoring of God. Authority is so vitally important. Why do we deal with false teaching in the church? Why does it creep in? It's because we simply don't want to honor the truth. We think we can skirt around it. We think we can push it aside in order to make us feel good, or to deal with something in our own minds, or maybe to get more people in the doors. But what it really is a dishonoring of God. Our children need to understand what honoring authority really means. Now again, he's not saying to us that we obey every authority in every situation. In situations where the authority above us would have us to do something evil, and we can't dishonor God in that situation. We still respectfully refuse to do the thing that's evil. And so our children need to be taught how to honor. And it begins with their parents. Yes, Roger. Which one?
It was the one about the one that said that was over
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what is it? What?
It's Matthew 8:21.
Matthew 8:21. Is that the context of the parable, or is that a different situation?
People that come up to him and say, I'm going to follow you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but there's like a series of them, right? Yeah. Yeah, there's like a series. There's one person that's bought a piece of property. There's one person that's just got married, right? So that's in Matthew 8, you said. So you can go back and read that. And that's at least that's the one I was referring to. Thank you, Miss Florence. Anything else? All right, so he talks to children, but he's not just going to leave Dad alone, is he? Now, we've already seen Dad is the authority in the home. So he says in verse 4, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. There's a lot there, so let's try to break it down a little bit. So the first thing you note that he says that you're not to do what? You're not to provoke your children to anger. Some translations may have the word wrath. You can, again, go and do your own study on the terminology there, but from what I understand, the word anger there maybe doesn't give us the clearest idea. maybe the better English word is exasperation. The idea of don't make your children get to the point of exasperation. In other words, don't, as a parent, you're not trying to push your children away from the Lord, but you're to do what? You're drawing them in. Yes, ma'am.
I was just going to say, sometimes you think like you're teasing them, and it's really hurting them. They're not like, they don't think it's funny. So you have to be careful with that. You don't see how they respond.
Yeah, so like situationally, and this is a problem with dads. I don't think this is generally a problem with the mom. Maybe it is in your home. But I think generally it's the men who have maybe a bigger issue with this. Sometimes you like to tease your children. And it's good to remind yourself of, you don't need to do that all the time. All right. Go ahead, Dwayne.
Well, I was just going to say that in the verse you were talking about, the term, you have some versions say anger, some say wrath.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's one that actually does say exasperation or something to that effect. But the difference in those words, anger means, okay, I'm mad at you. But wrath means I'm mad at you and I'm going to get back at you.
Mm-hmm.
And exasperation is even worse than that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it really shouldn't be just anger.
And
You're going to make your child anger, they're going to make you angry. That's just the way it is. But to do it to the point where
yes.
they want to get back at you and where they're no longer going to listen to you, that's where it becomes a problem.
Yeah, and I think that's a good way to put it. It is kind of, because anger is situational, right? Most of the time. We're going to be angry, and it's going to happen. You're going to get angry at them. They're going to get angry at you at times. But again, what's the context here? It is on what? Teaching your children to do what? Respecting authority. Ultimately, the authority of the Lord, right? You want to teach them, you need to honor God. That's ultimately what you're trying to do. And so what happens when you have a parent who does not act honorably with their children or consistently with their children? What are you teaching them? What about a parent who doesn't honor authority themselves? Right? What are you teaching your child? What about if you're inconsistent in your discipline with your children? What if you get really angry over little things where you've not really spelled out to you it's a big thing, but for them they think it's a little thing, and yet you blow your top, and then you let big things just kind of go by? What are you teaching them? Or what if you set a rule, an expectation, and they do not meet, they don't do what they're called to do, and yet you let it go on? What are you doing? What are you teaching them? What if you, as a father, allow your children to disrespect their mother? I think, I haven't done any studies on this, but one of the things that I feel has led to many of our problems is the fatherlessness in homes. Whether there's actually no father, or if there's a father who's not really present, and the mother is asked to do the job of the father. There's a lot of great moms out there who are in situations who are doing the best they can, who love their children, are trying to do what they should. Not a condemnation of them. But I do think in our culture, we have seen the father, not be as present in the home as he should be. And part of that is when you have a mother and father working as a team in a home, it's easier for both of them, and it's much better for the children. No, not in all situations. That's just not possible. But again, we're looking at generalities. So even if you have a mother who is doing her best and she's being the best mom she can, keep doing that. Be the best mom, role model for your children. Try to do what God's called you to do. But fathers, step up. Be dad. Be a Christian father who's actually present with your children. And so I think that's a large part of what's going on here. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, and just think about it this way. So you're right. Like when our children are little, we're all a lot bigger than they are, right? And we know a lot more. We're a lot smarter than they are, right? But there's going to get to a point where that child is not a little child anymore. And if we haven't, when they were little, taught them these key elements, yes, we need to teach them Scripture. But in this context, I think he's really talking about teach them to respect God. Teach them to respect God by respecting you. That's not authoritarian. That's not beating them. That's actually doing the hard work of training them. And showing them by how you live. So that when they get bigger, they're going to be set on the right path. All right. Good comments. Anything else about that? Just something, Becky?
A lot of pressure there.
No doubt. No doubt. All right. So he talks about parents. Let's go to the next one. My 2 minutes here. Then he turns to another situation that is really foreign to us in our modern culture, but let's look at it. I think there's a lot we can learn. So let's go to verse 5. He says, "Bondservants, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ." Notice the qualifier again. "Doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or is free." So an interesting text here. Again, this is not directly applicable to us in our modern culture, but there's definitely some application we need to take away. Again, I think the idea here is, again, authority and honoring authority. So he talks about bondservants. The literal translation there is the term slave. All right, so he is talking about a slave situation. Depends on which way I want to go on this. Yeah.
Yeah, and working with gladness and,
Yeah.
not just humdrumming it all the time. Because if you look like you're miserable, no matter what you're doing, you look like you're miserable, then people are going to wear your Christian light. Look, you're not really letting it shine very much if you're letting your job get you so down in the mouth.
Yeah, and I do think that's the application for us, right? Is again, if we take the concept of authority and we apply it to us, where would this apply in our lives? Well, it would apply to one of the areas would be our work situation, right? An employee situation or employer situation. I'm out of time. That'd be a good cliffhanger. Next week, we'll talk about that application and what's Paul talking about. next week. So come prepared for that, and then we'll cover the last part where he's talking about being a soldier of Christ, and then he'll give us a farewell. Again, thank you all for your discussion today. We'll continue this next week. We'll go ahead and dismiss now and be rejoined for our devotional in just a moment. Thank you.
Hey, how are you?
Yeah.